The Proverbs of Solomon, son of David, king of Israel, for gaining wisdom and instruction, for understanding words of insight, for receiving instruction in prudent behavior, doing what is right and just and fair, for giving prudence to those who are simple, knowledge and discretion to the young. Let the wise listen and add to their learning, and let the discerning get guidance, for understanding proverbs and parables, the sayings and riddles of the wise.
It's always good to start with the microphone on. How's everybody doing? All right. So Simon Says, is that what we're in today? So we're starting a series today, as these guys said, on Proverbs, and obviously, with it being called Solomon Says, it is a play on the children's game that many of us played when we were children, called Simon Says. So, since we're doing that, we're just going to start with a little game of Simon/Solomon Says today. So you guys ready? I'm just kidding. We're not going to do that. Some of you are like, oh, man, not another game. All right. But I did start thinking, like, as I was kind of preparing for today, like, who is Simon? And, like, why does everybody have to listen to him? Like, what did that guy do? Like, what is the origin story of that? Because and the first thing that came to my mind is, all right, Simon definitely wasn't a parent, and he definitely wasn't a boss, or he would know that not everybody just does what you say, not everybody just listens to you, right? So I did a little research to see what the origin story of Simon Says is, and you'll be surprised to find out I still do not know. I couldn't find it. Should have used AI, I suppose, but I just tried to do it myself. But while I was doing the research, I did find out this little fun fact. Apparently, there was an Atari game. Kids, there was a game called Atari. There was this Atari game, and it was based off of the kids' game Simon Says. And there was this trade show, some guys saw it, and they created this little jewel that some of you will remember, this little thing called Simon. All right? So now, how many of you in the room, just for kicks, how many of you in the room, by a grunt or show of hands, you remember Simon? Let me hear you. Let me see it. Some groans, moans. All right. Now, if you didn't raise your hand, of course you don't remember it because it came out in 1978, which was before most of you were born. All right? 1978. So I was talking, sometimes I have to test these illustrations with my younger staff members. So I was talking to one of our staff, and I said, hey, you remember this game, Simon? He's like, oh, yeah, I remember. It's like a memory game. And he said, yeah, I remember it. I said, do you have one? He's like, oh, no. He said, that was only for the rich kids. I was like, all right, so if you were born in the late 70s or in the late 80s, apparently the standard of affluence was if you had the game Simon. So if you didn't know, some of you were born into generational wealth, and you just didn't know it because you had the Simon game, right? But all that is a digression. Here was the principle of Simon Says. Whatever Simon says, you have to do it. If you don't, you're out of the game. Like, you lose, you're out, which I did find out, I did discover in my research, there are professional, I don't understand some of the jobs that people actually make money on these days, I will say that, but there are professional Simon Says people, like they show up to NBA basketball games and they just insult people with Simon Says and they're professionals, but the goal is to do what Simon says, and if not, you're out. Similarly, the goal of Proverbs is to do what Solomon says. Now, it's not like Simon Says where you have to, because in that game you have to, but you should do what Simon says, which for me begs the question, why? Why should I do what Solomon says? And the answer is because he is, and perhaps you've heard me say this, maybe you've heard someone else say this, he is the wisest man ever to walk on the face of the earth. And when wise people speak, we don't always, but we should listen. When there's wise advice given, we should take it in. So when wise people speak, we should listen. But I started thinking about that, and I'm like, okay, so what's the origin story of Solomon? Like, how does one become the wisest person on the face of the earth? I hate to tell you, some of you today, you thought you had that spot. You didn't realize Simon has that spot. Some of you are married to someone that thought they had that spot. Solomon has that spot. I don't know who Simon is or what the origin of that is, as we've established. But how does one become the wisest person on the face of the earth? And there's actually an origin story behind this. It actually is found in 1 Kings chapter 3. I would encourage you to go back and read this story. It's actually fascinating. But God appears to Solomon in a dream, and this is what he says. He says, ask for whatever you want me to give you. Now, just imagine with me, God showed up. And let me just say, if he showed up, I would prefer for him not to show up in a dream. I think that would freak me out, or not in all of his splendor and glory, but maybe in street clothes. God showed up, and he asked me this question: ask for whatever you want me to give you. This is the moment. This is your genie in a bottle moment where everything in your life and the lives of everybody that you know can change. What would you wish for? And the truth is, most of us wouldn't want to say this, but we would spend that moment, we would spend that opportunity on ourselves. Newer, bigger, nicer, faster, younger, less wrinkled. We would spend that on ourselves. Now, again, our first thought is no, but I would also spend it on others. But what would be the first thing? The first impact of this opportunity. And Solomon, he goes the complete opposite direction. He says, ask for whatever you want me to give you. And Solomon doesn't ask for anything for himself. But instead, he goes the other direction. He says, look, I'm young. He recognizes it. He says, I'm young. There's a lot that I don't know. There's a lot in life that hasn't happened, that I haven't experienced. And he said, my rule, my authority affects a lot of people. He said, God, if I could have anything, would you give me wisdom and discernment to lead? In other words, this is fascinating to me because this is not how I would have burned that wish. He takes that moment, instead of spending it on something for himself, he spends it for the sake of those on the other side of him. Give me wisdom, give me discernment for the sake of those that my authority, that my influence affects. The scriptures tell us that God was so pleased with this request. And I think, I can only imagine, because most of us wouldn't make this, he was so pleased with this request that he granted it. He said, because you have not asked for something for yourself, for riches, because you haven't asked for long life, because you haven't asked for me to squash out your enemies. How many of us would have had some form of a wish that had us getting promoted above someone else just not being at the office anymore? You know what I mean? He said, because you didn't spend your wish on any of those things, this opportunity, this moment, on any of those things, not only am I going to give you what you ask for, wisdom and discernment for the sake of those that you lead, I'm also going to give you something you did not ask for. I'm going to give you riches, and I'm going to give you honor with everyone that looks on you. And that became the legacy and the story of Solomon. So the moral of this story is, if you want a car, pray for wisdom. I'm just kidding. That is not the moral of the story. God knew his heart, right? There was no manipulating of a scheme. The honest move of his heart was he wanted wisdom for the sake of recognizing this moment, recognizing that he needed something that he didn't have access to on his own to influence the people that he influenced. So let me just stop and say this. Moms, dads, beg God for wisdom. Beg God for wisdom, because the decisions that you and I are making in our homes don't just affect us. There's a you on the other side of you that is affected by the way that we structure financially. Look, it will affect generations, the decisions we're making about morality. Beg God for wisdom as you parent. College students, beg God for wisdom. Beg God for wisdom in the relationships that you're in, or that you're headed toward, or that you're considering, because that relationship is not just about that relationship, and it certainly is not just about that moment, and it certainly is not just about you. There are other yous that are coming on the other side of you, and the decisions that we make today affect our tomorrow. So beg God. I'm telling you, beg God. Sit on the bed in the dorm room or in your apartment and say, God, give me wisdom for the sake of the yous on the other side of me, not just the you in the mirror. Give me wisdom, because I know that the decisions that I make and the things that I do don't just impact me or this moment. I think about teachers. Oh man, what a hard job, but so much opportunity. Beg God for wisdom. Doctors and lawyers and police officers and those of you that are in these fields where some of you are employers. You have people that report to you. Beg God for wisdom, not just for you, but for the sake of those on the other side of you. 1 Kings 4 goes on to tell us, which some of you are like, I thought this was a series on Proverbs. We're getting there. 1 Kings 4 tells us that Solomon wrote thousands of proverbs and poems. And while not all of Proverbs is written by Solomon, the majority of them are, and the remaining ones were the curated wisdom, if you could think of it this way, from ancient Israel. Generations of wisdom that were put down by Solomon. So if you can think of it this way, and let me just say this, let me back up and say this. My hope and our hope as a church is not that just you listen to sermons during this summer, what's remaining of the summer. I won't talk about that. I don't want you just to listen to sermons on the book of Proverbs. We want you to engage personally with the book of Proverbs. I want to encourage you to read it. 31 Proverbs, in one of those months where there's 31 days, one a day, it takes you through the month. This is the first book of the Bible that I was introduced to when I really began to awaken a relationship with Jesus, and it's life-changing. But I want to give you a couple of things as we lead in. The first one is this. When you read Proverbs, Proverbs are not promises. There are lots of promises in the Bible, but Proverbs are principles. There are lots of times where God makes promises to us, but in Proverbs, these are principles to live by. For example, maybe you've heard this one, maybe some of you are clinging to this one, and you should, but it's not a promise. If you've ever heard this, train up a child in the way they should go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. And you said, I claim that promise, which is great, but it's not a promise. It's a principle. Solomon's saying the general wisdom of generations, my wisdom, the general way that things work is when you train up a child in the way they should go, generally speaking, they will not depart from it. And here's what I believe. And let me just encourage you. Some of you parents, you're in a space right now where you've got a prodigal child that's just moved in a different direction. You raised them in the church. You don't know what happened. You don't know if they believe, but they're not there. And let me tell you, sometimes this principle doesn't happen the way we think. Sometimes God sets an anchor in the heart of a child or a teenager by the way that we lead in our home, and they drift, but at some point that anchor hits and it draws them back. But it's a principle. It's a principle, not a promise. So as you read Proverbs, I want you to think principle, not promise. I want you to think that it is the wisdom of ancient Israel, history of generations, curated wisdom, and the wisdom of the wisest man ever to walk on the face of the earth. So here's what I want to do. I want to give you an overview today of how to engage with the book of Proverbs. And then as we close, I want to look at one specific proverb in Proverbs chapter 11. There are lots of proverbs all throughout, so there'll be a lot of times one proverb coupled in two different verses. So we're going to kind of give you the overview, and then I want to close our time today by looking at one specific proverb. So at the outset of this book, Solomon, very first verse, he establishes that he is the author of Proverbs. He says, I'm the one that writes these. And then in the very second verse, he tells us what it's about. But there's these two big ideas that are all throughout the book of Proverbs. They're the framework, the underpinnings, and it's these two ideas of attaining wisdom and the fear of the Lord. Now, you're going to see these all throughout the book of Proverbs. They're the underpinnings, again, that weave all throughout the book. And so after Solomon says, I'm the one who wrote Proverbs, the very next thing he says in verse 2, he says, I want to tell you now why I wrote Proverbs. He says, for attaining wisdom and discipline, for understanding words of insight. And there's our framework. For attaining wisdom. He says, this is the purpose of why I wrote Proverbs. Now, in Hebrew, the word for wisdom is literally this idea of skill or applied knowledge. So if you can think of it this way, don't think philosopher, think practitioner. So Proverbs were written, the idea was we're going to introduce some insights, some wisdom that if you apply it will lead to a very different kind of life. So this is not just, Proverbs aren't just something you ponder. It's not just philosophy. It's not like, oh, that was an inspiring thought. I enjoyed that poem. It's not that. The idea of attaining wisdom is this idea of skill or applied knowledge, is that you see something, you learn something, and then you do something. So don't think ponder, think do something. Then a few verses later, he introduces the second idea that kind of frames all of Proverbs. In Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7, he says this. He says that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and discipline. And he introduces this idea of the fear of the Lord. And let me just tell you, whatever you think of when you think of fear, it's probably not what we're talking about here. Like, I don't know if you think of, like, some of you are afraid of tight spaces. You're afraid of heights. You're now afraid of Carowinds after that situation a couple weeks ago. Some of you maybe, I don't know, I'm afraid of restaurants that they might not be clean. Anybody with me on that? Yeah. So I got an amen right there. Freaky clowns. Anybody? You guys remember when they were making the It remake? And there were like freaky clown sightings. Like sometimes I'm doing this because some of them were holding knives. Nope. Let me just tell you, if I ever see a freaky clown, one of you will have to bail me out of jail, your pastor, because I will swerve hard, right? But I don't know what you think of when you think of fear. We all have these fears and these anxieties, but that's not what we're talking about here. That is not the point. It's not that kind of fear. This kind of fear is reverence and awe. It's this idea that the underpinning idea of awe, when we think of it, is this reality that there is a God and I am not him. There is a God and I am not that God. And therefore, since there is a God and I am not God, it is not mine to decide what is right and wrong. It is not mine to define what is good and what is bad. They're God's. One of the ideas, and again, this is all throughout the book of Proverbs, is this idea. One of the things when we think of the fear of the Lord, this awe of God, is this recognition that God is God and that I am not. And therefore, I do not set the terms and the boundaries of right and wrong. I do not set the terms and boundaries of what's good and what's bad. I don't set any of those boundaries. Those are God's to set. The definition setter is God, not me. And if you're around here long, or if you've been around here long, you have heard me say this, or you will hear me say this, that truth is not something that we decide. Truth is something we discover. This is not ours to create. And that's one of the ideas that runs all throughout the wisdom of Proverbs. I have people ask me all the time my opinion on things. Sometimes I want to go, I'm just another guy. But because I have a position of authority, and because I teach the scripture, and because I'm in leadership, and because I usually have a microphone, people ask my opinion on everything imaginable, from politics to politicians to certain ideological things. People ask me about homosexuality. They ask me about the transgender movement. I have, like in the last several years especially, more questions than ever about race and all that's happening. Every hot topic that you can imagine, people want my opinion. They ask me, they say, hey, what do you think about? And always asking my opinion. And I don't say this, but oftentimes what I want to say is my opinion doesn't matter. It doesn't matter because it's just my opinion. What matters is what God says, not my opinion. And this is what I'm talking about. Truth, this idea, is something that we discover as humans, not something that we decide. And this is one of the very principles that runs all throughout the book of Proverbs, that the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. This awe of God, the very premise of the awe of God is God and I am not. And therefore, I'm going to let him be the one that finds the definitions. And my narrative, your narrative, exists within his, not the other way around. Isn't it interesting how many times we invite God to fit into our narrative? But Proverbs would say, no. The way this works with the fear of the Lord is my narrative exists within his, and ultimately, it doesn't matter what Chris Brown's opinion is. So, as I said that, and as I walked through this message this week, I thought, man, that feels uncomfortable. And when I say that, there are going to be people that feel uncomfortable with that. And there may be some of you that as you hear me say it, you're like, yeah, right on. And others of you, maybe you think, man, that just feels old school. Like it feels old. Chris, aren't you introducing an idea that's kind of like outdated? Like maybe you're not with the times. My kids remind me often that I'm not with the times, right? But here's what I would say. Yes, this is old school. This is old school wisdom, curated from generations of ancient Israel's wisdom and curated from the wisest man and spoken by the wisest man to ever walk on the face of the earth, Solomon. So this idea of the fear of God, it implies that I as a human, that I humble myself to God, even when it's inconvenient. And I have found in my life that sometimes oftentimes it's inconvenient. This idea of the fear of the Lord implies that I humble myself before God, even if I disagree. Can we say that in church? Have you ever seen something or read something, you're like, I don't know if I agree with that. Even if it doesn't make sense, even if it doesn't feel good. And this theme is all throughout the book of Proverbs. So these two big ideas are the framework for the entire book of Proverbs. This idea of attaining wisdom, this idea of the fear of the Lord. And if you read the book of Proverbs, the first 9 chapters, there are these metaphorical conversations between a father and a son, perhaps some literal conversations as well that Solomon had with his sons, but metaphorical conversations where a father gives wisdom to a son, but particularly when we pick up in chapter 10 through the rest, these two ideas, attaining wisdom and the fear of the Lord, are applied to every subject imaginable, from sex to money to morality to issues of justice in our culture, to debt issues, to family conflict, everything you can imagine. These two ideas, attaining wisdom and the fear of the Lord, are applied. So that's your overview for the book of Proverbs. That's where we're going to be journeying in the next 6 weeks. But for our remaining time, I just want to look at one proverb. So let me change gears just a little bit. If you had to guess, now there's a little crowd participation. If you had to guess, what is the best-selling nonfiction book in publishing history? And let me just, before you guys like, oh, this is easy, it's in church. The answer is the Bible, okay? Excluding the Bible, aside from the Bible, what would you think? And you say, maybe you don't know if it's top 1, but if you think maybe it's in the top 1, 2, or 3, best-selling nonfiction publishing books in history, or books in publishing history. Easy for you guys to say. All right, call some out. What do you think? Lord of the Rings, that's a good guess. Say it again, Pilgrim's Progress. It's a good guess, too. Any others?
Everything I learned in kindergarten.
Yeah, everything I learned in kindergarten. I had a Simon in kindergarten. All right, anybody else?
The dictionary.
Dictionary, good guess. No one's got it yet. Narnia, no, but that's a solid selection, though, I'd like to say. It was a little book called The Purpose-Driven Life, written by a pastor named Rick Warren. His book, it's hard to find the accurate numbers because it's still selling like crazy, has sold over 50 million copies. It's in 137 different languages. And the first line of his book says this: it's not about you. It's great. He starts off insulting the reader. Bestseller of all times. Drop the mic. When I think about this, this is fascinating to me because this is the most countercultural statement that you can probably make. And his books are still selling. This idea, this flies in the face of pretty much everything that marketers are trying to make you and I believe. Every movie you watch, all the music that you listen to, this is the exact opposite of what they're telling you. He's saying it's not about you. They're saying it's exactly about you. Everything we read, see, and are marketed toward says, listen, you deserve this. You get yours. You do you, man. You figure this out. Take care of you. And no one else is going to take care of you. You got to do what makes you happy. You got to go places that make you feel good. If you can afford it, you can do it. It's yours, man. Build your platform. Get some likes. Protect your brand at all costs. This is the message. If you're going to spend it on you. If you want to save it on you. That's what you do, but it is about you. And yet here, the bestseller of all times, the leading line of his book, it flies in the face of all that. He says, it is not about you. Warren goes on to explain that this idea of a personal quest for fulfillment and satisfaction, you can read this mostly in the first chapter, he talks about this, but a quest for personal satisfaction and meaning and purpose can only be found in doing what God placed you on earth to do. And I would submit and I would suggest that most of that especially as we read through the New Testament and we look at the words of Jesus, but you'll find it in the words of Solomon as well. Most of that, what you and I were placed on this earth to do, is not about the you in the mirror. It's about the you on the other side of you. But that is not what culture tells us. One of the ways that you and I will find the greatest purpose in our lives is when we realize that our purpose isn't found by focusing everything on the you in the mirror, but on the you on the other side of you. I think it's the very thing that God granted Solomon the wisdom for is one of the things that we are purposed for. To not spend everything that we have and everything that we've been given and all of our influence and our talents on us, but on the you on the other side of you. And Proverbs says it over and over again. Solomon says it over and over again. This was core to the teachings of Jesus if you read through the teachings of Jesus. So I want to give us just one example. Proverbs chapter 11, if you want to turn there, I'm going to put them on the screens. Proverbs chapter 11, verse 10 and 11. I want to read these, and I do want to explain Proverbs a little bit as I do it. But the first part of this verse, Solomon says, when the righteous prosper, meaning when it goes well for people of character. Like when people who are doing the right thing, but again, not as defined by us, as defined by God, because God is a definition setter of what is right and wrong. When it goes good for people that are doing the right thing, as defined by God, he says, the city rejoices, which I think is an interesting thing. The city rejoices. Now, then in the very next piece, and this often happens in Proverbs, they'll take an idea and then they'll either compare it or they'll contrast it with the opposite to make the point. And it's the next one he contrasts. He says, when the wicked perish, there are shouts of joy. Conversely, you know, when the righteous succeed, when those that are doing right by the way that God sees right in the world, the city rejoices. Like people around you celebrate. On the other side of it, when the wicked perish, there are shouts of joy. And then he continues and he reinforces the idea by saying it a different way. He says, through the blessings of the upright, a city is exalted. And this is a really powerful concept. He's saying, hey, if you have a hashtag blessed life, like you see it, right? It's like hashtag blessed life. Sipping on a mojito at the pool, hashtag blessed life, living good. Kids are out of school, headed towards the beach, hashtag blessed life. And then until about a month in, then it's like, kids are about to go back to school, hashtag blessed life for the rest of us, right? Here's what he's saying. Solomon's saying, if you have a blessed life, and he implies that there is choice, and you choose to bless, that you recognize at some level of your life, you grew up with a Simon, right? At some level of your life, you are blessed. Some level of your life, you've been given influence or skill or something to impact the world. You realize the blessing and you don't allow it to be settled on you, but instead you bless others. He says there's something intentional that happens there. Things change. He says, in other words, it's not just about having blessings, it's about inviting others into our blessings. There's one thing to recognize your blessings, another thing to invite someone into the blessing. And he says, in the result, when someone with the blessed life invites someone else into their blessings, the result is this, that the city is exalted. The Hebrew word there literally means lifted up. The city, the people around you, they're lifted up. Then he says, but by the mouth of the wicked, the city is destroyed, or it is destroyed. See, what Solomon is saying is when it goes well for people who are doing good or doing things God's way. And I think this is interesting. He's not saying that God's people are always blessed. He's saying if you're God's people and you are blessed, he says when that happens, people celebrate. Perhaps people who don't even know you, when you're winning, people are going to celebrate. Why? Because they know that if you win, they win. That it's a mutual thing, that when you succeed, when you are blessed, they are blessed, that there is a two-way street. Imagine being that kind of person, that everyone knows if you're blessed, they're going to be blessed. And this is what he's saying. He's saying this idea that when someone is blessed and they're living God's way, that they lift up the standard of everybody around them. One of the things, we have lots of community partners that do amazing work in our community and throughout the world. And one of the things that I've said, and I say often, you'll hear me say it, and different people on stages, I want the fact that we exist to make their existence better. We've said that for years. Just the pure play fact that we exist should raise the level of existence for others in our lives. This is what Solomon is saying. Man, when I was reading this, I kept thinking about my family. And now some of you have heard me tell portions of my family story. My dad is my hero, and I know that's not everybody's story. My dad, just incredible man, one of the most generous people that I've ever known, but he taught us. But you can only teach so much. At some point, we as kids have to decide if we're going to do this. But my brother is one of the most generous people that I know. I literally, as I was reading this proverb, I kept thinking about his life. The generosity was modeled for him, but he chose it. And here's the reality. When I think about my brother, if things go well for my brother, things go well for all of us. Like, every time he has a blessing, he invites other people into his blessing. His co-workers, he has a lot of employees. He was telling me this incredible story. He's got one of the guys that works for him has cancer. And the things that he's doing that oftentimes churches don't even do, it was unbelievable. He's blessing the people that work for him, those that are related to him, his church, everybody around him. When there are blessings for him, it elevates the life and the realities of everybody around him. He always invites other people into his blessings. And I bet you know people like that. And I bet you know people who could be like that. But instead, they're spending it on themselves. And we're not just talking about money here. This is not about money. It's about this idea of when you have any portion of your life that's blessed and you invite other people into it, it raises the standard. And you know what else? It's not about wealth. This is about the condition of your heart. There are people that have very little in the world's terms of how they define much and little. But they're just blessed and they know it and they share that blessing often. So when Solomon's saying this idea that if you're living as God intends and the blessings come, again, it's not that they do, but if they come, it raises the level, the water level, so to speak, of everyone around you. And he says this idea is for gaining wisdom. Remember what wisdom is? It's for practice, not for knowing. He's saying if you get this, that when it's blessed for you and you raise the level of others, if you get this, if you do this, it's going to lead to a very different kind of life. Not if you ponder this, but if you do this. This is an insight that, if applied, will lead to a very different kind of life. So I want to encourage you and I want to challenge you with this morning. If your life is better, and let me just tell you it is. We all have challenges as we walked in here this morning, but if your life is better, other people's life should be better as a result. If you have been blessed, be a blessing. Our lives, our existence should by nature lift the lives of those around us. I was reading through Proverbs just as I began to get ready for this series. Guys, I was so struck, so convicted, so challenged personally. The reason I started with this verse is because this verse wrecked me. Like I was reading it, and I just had this moment. I sat back, and I just had a self-reflection. I said, Chris, is your life, this is me, Chris, is my life, is it lifting the people around me? Is it lifting the people around me? And I want it to desperately. Chris, when you are blessed in any arena of your life, are you inviting other people into that blessing? Man, so many ways I want to do that so much better. But I want to ask you guys this question. Is your life, don't just make it about me. The sermons are really hard for me to live, right? Is your life lifting the lives of people around you? Because as Rick Warren, I think, so aptly and counterculturally said, it's not about you, and it's not about me. In fact, that pursuit will leave you destitute and empty. You may get all the stuff you tried to get, and it won't provide any of the things you thought it would provide. But when we realize and start to use our influence and whatever God has placed in our hands to raise the water level, to lift people up. Let me just say, I said it earlier. I think teaching is one of the most incredibly difficult jobs on the planet. For those of you teachers in the room, I just want you to know every time you step into that classroom, you have an opportunity to lift people. If you're a business leader and you have employees, you have an opportunity to lift your employees. If you're a college student, you're going to have so many opportunities in that dorm room, in that classroom, to lift other students that are in an emotional place that they never thought they would be. There's no greater place at which this lands and takes shape than in our parenting. I got so much to learn about this, but listen, are we lifting our children? My wife is so much better at this than I am. I have so far to go. But with what God has placed in your hands, are you lifting people? Raise the water level. Why? Because Solomon says. I want to close with just telling you a quick story, and then I want to read a quote to you. In the early days of our church, and some of you have heard this story, some of you haven't, some of you are brand new to this place, it'll reveal a lot about just kind of the heart of our church. We're about 2 years into our church. We had a little over 100 people showing up. We started with 13 people. We had a little over 100 people showing up, and we didn't have a building of our own. We set everything up and tear it back down and go put it in a storage unit every single week. And it was exhausting, and every week I thought, I don't think anybody's going to show up next week. And every week I thought, I don't know if I want to show up next week. It was hard. It was hard. And I thought, I'm not very good at this. And I don't know if this is going to last. And I don't know if it's working. And I remember in that season, God used a passage in Acts, in the book of Acts, just to break my heart around this question. If we were to be extracted from the city, aside from the 100 people or so that were attending our church, would anybody mourn our loss? Was there anyone that we were serving and inviting into blessing in a way that if we were gone, they would be bummed out? And I did not like the answer. And in that season, it was pivotal because our focus began to shift from the you in the mirror, so to speak, to the you on the other side of us. And we started to think, man, what does it look like to engage a city? What does it look like to engage a community? And we launched this initiative. Some of you were here and you remember it was called the Now Project. It was around just investing in the homeless and houseless community of our city. And the goal was to invite people into our blessing and to lift people up. People who we knew some of them might never attend our church, and that wasn't the point. It was just to raise the water level for everybody in our city. And I remember we raised $23,000 for this initiative. And while I was ecstatic, I had this moment of like big faith and big fear all together because our budget in that season was literally $22,000 a month. And most time we were not taking checks, those of us that worked at the church. We very rarely actually hit our budget. And I had this moment of like, yay, God. Then I thought, I got in this to serve the homeless, not to be one of them. And it was a fear, like most people didn't know this at the time, but Angie and I were in fear of losing our own home at that time. And I just remember thinking like, what have I done? And we never in our history had a $45,000 month. And I thought, God, people aren't going to give twice. They're just going to move their dollars from us to them. And what have I done? Never in our history we had a $45,000 month until that month. $45,000 come in. And it makes me emotional still thinking about it. It was almost audible that this whisper from God, it was like he was saying, you take care of them, and I'll take care of you. And it reminds me of this quote from financial expert Ron Blue. He says, see, when your hands are clenched, not only does it keep our resources in, but it keeps God's blessings out. And that image has stuck with me. And so we're going to go back to our roots with some beautiful things that we're going to do. And we're launching today. You guys are here. It's such a great day. We're launching an initiative called For You. And it's for the yous on the other side of you in our community. And we're just going to do what we've done throughout our existence as a church, and we're going to raise the water level for the people in our city. And we're going to invite people into our blessing. But I want to tell you how this happened. I love this. A family came to us in our church and said, hey, they weren't even here when we did this. And many of you weren't. They said, hey, we're already doing this. In other words, we recognize this is just our responsibility, but we want to see if the rest of the church wants to come and be a part. Usually people say, hey, we got a great idea for you guys to do. They said, hey, we're doing this. We'd love for you to come along, and they wanted to invite you guys into this journey. So I want to introduce the Marshalls to tell just a little bit of the origin story of what we're doing, and then I'll spend time wrapping up.
Hi, my name's Bob.
I'm Sheila.
And we're assembling bags to help the homeless and unhoused in Charlotte and the surrounding communities. It's going to be called For You. Our passion for this really started on a family vacation back in the early 2000s. And we were driving through San Francisco, came up to a stoplight, and there was a man that needed help, had a sign, and I didn't even really look at him. And as we pulled off, my 6-year-old son Gavin said, "Dad, that man needed help. Why didn't you give him anything or help him out in any way?" And it really broke our hearts and started our passion for this. There are going to be bags for both men and women that are going to contain some simple things that will make their lives easier: snacks, a water, a new pair of socks, but also a resource card that is going to give them organizations and ways to find help, some avenues to get on track that they may not have had before. And it's a difficult thing for them to navigate, and this might just be that one thing that helps them navigate it a little bit more easily.
But more than anything, we want to include a handwritten note by you to let them know that we see them, and so does God. That God loves them just like the rest of us, and He wants the best for them.
This is really a simple process. It's a matter of pulling up to a stoplight, seeing somebody in need, and rolling down your window, asking them their name, and handing them a bag and saying, "Hey, this is for you," to let them know that we see them.
And maybe even ask them if you can pray for them that day. That lets them know that we do care, we do see them, and so does God. This might not be something that will change their direction that day, but it'll provide some comfort and more than anything, some encouragement. And it's our hope and prayer that this is something, maybe some of the resources that they could get a hold of that would change their path in life.
One other benefit of this is that it will open our eyes. We can see our city in a different way, and we can lead our family in a different way, where our families will be able to see us with open eyes, recognizing the needs in our city and helping solve those needs, and they can follow suit with eyes wide open. You know, we've been coming to church here for quite a while, and we don't want to just attend church. We want to make a difference here at the church and in our city. We want to change our city. We want to take Sunday into Monday, and into Tuesday, and into Wednesday, keep it going. And we want as many people on board with us as possible. Get a bag. Try it one time and pass it out. I think you'll find that if your kids see you do that, or even if you're alone, and you can maybe put a smile on somebody's face that you wouldn't have otherwise, I think you might be hooked.
So our dream with For You is there's several things, and so I want to go through these really quickly. I'm really excited about it. This is the DNA of our church. This is an initiative we're launching to start something. This comes out of the heart of our church, and I think the heart of what we're called to be as followers of Jesus, if you're a follower of Jesus. But 3 things that we're looking for, and you kind of heard them there. We want to invite ourselves to see, as a church, to see our community in a new way and begin to take responsibility for it. Like it's ours, right? And we don't for a second think that a bag is going to solve everything for someone, but it does add value. It adds value to them. And so that's one of the other things. We want to add value to the people on the other side of us. We want to lift them up. We want to raise the water level. We want people to know that someone is praying for you, and we really want to do that. Pray for the people that are receiving these bags. And the third one, and I think this is really important, we want to model selfless generosity for a generation. We want them to see it. So tell your kids why you're doing this. If you do this with kids, if you've got teenagers, whoever, make sure that you're modeling this for a generation, that there's no them, there's only us. There's only us in this community, and we steward it together. And so I want to wrap up with this quote from Tim Keller, one of my heroes in the faith that just passed away this year. I read this quote from his book, Center Church, and this is what he says. He said, "We could argue that the greatest problem for the church today is our inability to connect with non-believers in a way that they understand. Isn't it a major issue that the evangelical church exists as a subcultural cul-de-sac?" Meaning that we're our own little world. This is what he's saying. We're our own little world that oftentimes is separate from the broader context that we're embedded. Sometimes we don't really see or know what's going on outside of our community. He says, unable to speak the gospel intelligibly to most Americans, and is perceived to be concerned only with increasing its own power rather than the common good. That's devastating. if that's the image or the reality of the church. This is what Solomon was saying. Solomon was saying that our success should be celebrated. When we do this thing God's way, we should raise and lift the level of everybody around us. He said, of course it is. He says, early Christian bishops in the Roman Empire, by contrast, were so well known for identifying with the poor and the weak that eventually, though part of a minority religion, they were seen to have the right to speak for the local community as a whole. This is remarkable, especially if you consider the voice and influence of the church now. People don't look at the church and have a voice. The church is trying to earn a voice because there's no credibility. They earned a voice by how they served the poor and the marginalized. Caring for the poor and the weak became, ironically, a major reason for the cultural influence the church eventually came to wield. And then he closes with this powerful yet haunting statement. If the church does not identify with the marginalized, it will itself be marginalized. This is God's poetic justice. Tim Keller. So the question is your life lifting the lives of people around you? Ancient wisdom. This is a better life. Is our church collectively lifting the lives of people around us? And if you get excited about that, let's do this, and let's do it together. Solomon says that we should. Let me pray for us. Father, you're good, and I need wisdom that's beyond me. God, I acknowledge that there are times where the things that I see in your word, they're hard. They're hard to do. They're hard to understand. But God, give us the wisdom to lean in and recognize that you are God and that we are not. God, break our hearts. Give us compassion for those that you have compassion for, and move us to action, Father, and all of those things. God, whatever thing you need to remain in the hearts and minds of people this morning from this message, I pray that it would remain. I pray they'd be thinking about it Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. And Father, I pray that these simple acts wouldn't just be a change in our community, but they'd be a change in us. We ask this in the precious and the powerful name of Jesus. Amen and amen. Hey, a couple quick things before we go our separate ways, or at least before we go to the foyer to have some fun, and I'll tell you about that. We actually have some books from Keller, the guy that I just read this from. So we have several devotionals, and I would encourage you, just read through the book of Proverbs. But he and his wife, Kathy, actually have a devotional on the book of Proverbs that is a year long, so you can read it, and I would love for you to engage. We have a handful of those in the resource area. You can find them online as well if you want to do that. But I would encourage you to buy that or some kind of devotional on Proverbs to go. And then for you, let me give you some instructions. So all summer long, we're doing something called Take 5, where the idea has been take 5 minutes in the foyer, have a few conversations, laugh, meet a few people, and that's what we've been doing. And so today we're going to do it around these bags. So here's what we have. We have a assembly line. We'd love for every one of you to be involved. So check your kids out. Next service, we've got teenagers on the other side that we'll bring over as well to do this. But make sure that you do this with your kids, if you have kids with you, and just go through. There's a bag. The marshals are going to be out there, some of our guest services team, and put all the different items in. And here's what we're saying. These bags cost us about $20 to $25 to put them together. Different times of year, we may put different things in them. You can do one. Any donation of any amount. We're going to do this either way. But some of you have the capacity to give $5. That's all you can do. Some of you can donate $1,000 and make this thing push forward. So just get involved. Have some skin in the game. We're going to do this no matter what. We want you to be able to receive the blessing of it. We want you to be engaged in it, have some skin in the game. So come be a part of it. Do that. And then also, I would just like to say one last thing. Have a blessed life. #blessed life. All right. Hey, you guys have a great day. We'll see you in the foyer.